وعلى سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Now firstly I would like to apologize for last week's lesson. Those of you who attended will remember that we were having the lesson and then all of a sudden the lesson finished, the screen became blank. So my apologies, because it was the very first time I was actually doing online teaching, and I didn't actually realize that when the time finishes the screen will automatically become blank and we'll lose that contact between the student and the teacher. So inshallah I won't make that mistake or that shortcoming today. So I'll actually in advance tell or remind the students that this is how much time we have left, so if anybody is asking any questions then they will be able to ask the questions properly. Before we start, we got a few minutes before we start the lesson. A couple of things. Firstly, can everyone able to hear my voice clearly? If you could just send me a mail or a message at the bottom. So that's one. And the second, and the second particular request, or the second particular point, is that does anybody have any questions they would like to ask regarding last week's lesson before we inshallah start this week's lesson? Any questions anybody want to ask or pose from last week's lesson? So you could just write a message on the right hand side and then inshallah I'll try to answer it. No. Inshallah we will just wait for a couple of minutes until 2 o'clock, and inshallah we'll continue with the lesson at 2 o'clock. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask for the next couple of minutes, then they could do so by using the message on the right hand side of your screen, and inshallah we could I'll take some questions before we start. And also if the hope everybody could hear as well, so if the voice everything is clear, then as long as we get the admin side up and running, then inshallah we could start at 2 o'clock. Okay, one of the sisters just emailed that I'm not able to hear anything. So is that the case with the other brothers and sisters, or is it just a particular issue with that sister there? If you could just reply back. Okay, somebody's asking that. Okay, I think quite a few of you probably got that problem then. Okay, I think a lot of the okay, okay, how is it now? Can everybody hear still, or is it still the problem? Can everybody hear everything, or Okay. Can everybody hear still, or is that still a problem? Hello. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Can everybody hear, or can everybody hear? Okay, can everybody hear, or is it a bit better? Okay, um, Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Is it a bit more clear? Can everybody hear properly? Would you be able to send a message? Okay, I think the problem's probably a bit more sorted out now. Yep. Okay, sorry for the delay. I don't know what exactly happened. So inshallah we'll continue with the lesson inshallah. Okay, now just a quick recap of last week's lesson. In last week's lesson we made a start on the topic of intimacy in marriage, and in last week's lesson I mentioned 3 points. Number one, regarding what intentions we should have when it comes to intimacy, and the second point I mentioned was with regards to intimacy or relations. It is considered to be a right of both the husband and the wife. And then the third point I went on to mention was with regards to how often, in other words, how often is a person or a husband and wife should have relations with each other. So these were the 3 main points I touched on in last week's lesson. Now the way this week's lesson is going to plan out, inshallah, I'll make a start on the next section of your handouts, and after each section I will give everyone an opportunity, if there is a need, to ask me some questions about what we have discussed. Now the next part of the handouts is regarding the haram times. In other words, when it is considered to be unlawful and haram to have relations with one's wife. Like which times, say for example, where a person or a husband or even a wife as well is not allowed to have relations, is not allowed to have any sexual intimacy with the wife or with the spouse. What are the haram times? Now I've mentioned there in the handouts which is in front of you that it is unlawful and haram for a husband to have relations with his wife during her periods, so what we call in Arabic as haze, so during her periods, and also during postnatal bleeding, which in Arabic is called nifas. So during those 2 times, i.e. number 1 periods, and number 2 nifas, i.e. postnatal bleeding, it is unlawful and haram for a husband to have relations, to have intimacy with his wife during those 2 periods. Now let me explain the reason behind it. Firstly, it is mentioned in the Holy Quran in Surah Baqarah, verse number 222, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ, i.e. the companions, they are asking you about mahid, about menstruation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Qul, i.e. O Prophet Muhammad, Qul, say, huwa adhan, fa'tazilu nisaa fil mahid, that it is impurity, so therefore refrain or stay away from your wives during their impurity. In other words, stay away from your wives during their nifas, during their postnatal bleeding, during their haze, during their periods. Why? Because that blood which is coming out of the womb, it is impure, it is toxic. So therefore do not have relations with them during that particular time. So in other words, for a husband to have relations with his wife during her periods, for a husband to have relations with his wife after postnatal bleeding. Again, let me just explain what we mean by postnatal bleeding. Postnatal bleeding is the bleeding a woman or a sister experiences after she gives birth to a child, and that could last up to 40 days, but we'll come back to that in later on in the talk. But during that period, it is unlawful for a husband to have relations with his wife during her postnatal bleeding, and also during her haze and during her menstruation cycle as well. So that is the Quranic perspective of the impermissibility of relations with one's wife. There's also a very famous hadith as well, and this hadith can be found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, and also something similar can be found in Sunan Abu Dawood, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, Man ata ha'izan, that whoever approaches a woman who's in a menstruation cycle, aw imra'atan fi duburiha, or whoever approaches a woman from her back, i.e. what we call anal sex, and this is something which we will touch on later on, aw kahinan, or whoever goes to a fortune teller or to a soothsayer, فَقَدْ كَفَرَ بِمَا أُنزِلَ عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then indeed such a person has rejected. Kafara means that he has rejected that which was revealed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In other words, that person has become a disbeliever. That person has gone out of the fold of Islam because of the actions which he has done. In other words, approaching his wife while she was on a period. Number 2, approaching his wife from behind. Or number 3, by going to a fortune teller or a soothsayer, because he has done something which is totally indecent and gross. So therefore Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that such a person has left the fold of Islam. فَقَدْ كَفَرَ بِمَا أُنزِلَ عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Such a person has gone out of the fold of Islam because of his actions. Now obviously I'm sure many of you probably may have come across this hadith before, or may have heard something similar like that. And when he says that somebody has left the fold of Islam, it means that they haven't actually totally left the fold of Islam. We kind of interpret these hadiths in terms of, we say that they have done something severe, that their action could mean that they have gone out of the fold of Islam. Or another interpretation which we can give of this hadith is to make it act as a deterrent, that husbands should not approach their wife from behind, husbands should not have relations with their wives during their menstruation, that to make this hadith act as a deterrent, that never ever, or don't you ever think about doing something like that. That's why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has mentioned this hadith, and he's mentioned it in that particular way. So that is the second kind of proof, you could say, from the books of hadith, or from the sources which indicates towards the impermissibility or having relations with one's wife during her menstruation period, during her postnatal bleeding. There's a message on my screen where somebody is asking that is this hadith in Tirmidhi or in Abu Dawood. So the hadith which I mentioned is from Sunan Tirmidhi, but there are similar words to this hadith which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawood as well. Now the next point which I want to mention about having relations with one's wife during her periods is that, why is it impermissible? Why is it impermissible? Why is it unlawful? Now the answer, as I was explaining right at the beginning, is that the blood which comes out from a woman's womb during that particular period, that blood is toxic. It's kind of toxic blood. It's not like your normal bleeding. It's like filthy, it's smelly, and it's toxic. And it's mentioned, even though it's very, very rare, but it's mentioned that if a husband was to have relations with his wife during that period, and just say for argument's sake the wife falls pregnant, but as already explained, girls, everyone, that it's rare. What I mean by that is that it's very unlikely that a woman will fall pregnant during that particular period. It's rare, but obviously our Aqidah and our belief is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-powerful. So even if he wants to, if he decides to, then I'm sure Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could make someone fall pregnant even though the person had intercourse or relations with his wife during her period. So it's mentioned that even though it's rare, but it is possible for a woman to fall pregnant if, say, her husband had relations with her during her periods. And doctors have said that what will happen is that the most likelihood, or the chances are, that if the woman does fall pregnant, she will give birth to a deformed child. She would give birth to a deformed child. So therefore, having relations with the wife during her periods, it's haram, it's painful for her, it's disgusting. Whilst at the same time, if she was to fall pregnant, then the child she will give birth to, most likely that child will be born with genetic diseases, will be born deformed. And even doctors have said this as well. So what I'm actually saying is not from my own kind of opinions or my own kind of research. Even if you were to ask doctors, they will also more or less give you the same information and the same kind of opinion as well, that there is a greater risk and a greater likelihood of children being born deformed in that particular situation. So in a nutshell, having relations with one's wife during her periods, during her nifas, her postnatal bleeding, is unlawful and is haram. Now this then takes me on to the next point which I want to mention, and that is, just very briefly without going into any detail, because obviously this has got to do more with tahara and purification, and that is regarding the minimum days of haze and menstruation and also the minimum days and the maximum days of nifas and postnatal bleeding. Now, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimullah, he's of the opinion that for haze, i.e. for menstruation cycle, the minimum is 3 days. The minimum is 3 days. And the maximum is 10 days. So in other words, 3 days is the minimum period of menstruation, and the maximum is 10 days. So during those 10 days, or during this 10-day period, it is unlawful for a husband to have relations with his wife. However, if his wife, say for argument's sake, bled for less than 3 days, say 1 or 2 days, or she bled for 10 days, but what's happening is that she's bleeding for more than 10 days, i.e. 11 days, 12 days, 13 days, and so on and so forth. So in that situation, if she just bled for 1 or 2 days, or she's bleeding more than 10 days, i.e. on day 11, day 12, day 13, day 14, then I'm sure all of you who are attending the course at the moment, you must have read something that any surplus bleeding, in fiqh terms, it is known as istihada. It is known as istihada. And istihaza is known as surplus bleeding, and surplus bleeding or istihaza does not stop a husband from having relations with his wife. In other words, the husband can have relations with his wife, say when she is bleeding, but that bleeding is istihada. So if it's like extra bleeding, the husband can have relations with her. There's no problem, there's no kind of detestability or anything like that. That is totally allowed. But when it is unlawful is during the menstruation period. And the same also goes for postnatal bleeding, that in the Hanafi fiqh, there is no minimum limit of postnatal bleeding. In other words, a woman's postnatal bleeding or nifas could be for a few hours, could be for a couple of days. So there isn't a set limit of the minimum days required for postnatal bleeding. You know, there are occasions sometimes where a mother could give birth to a child and she doesn't even bleed at all. She doesn't even bleed at all. And I think some of you may have studied with Cordoba Academy Nurul Izah. And in Nurul Izah, there is actually a text there where he actually explains that if a woman gives birth to a child, but no blood comes out, so her wuzu will break, but that's the only thing. In other words, her wuzu will break, and she will have to obviously, from the next salah onwards, pray her salah. Why? Because no blood has come out. And it's also mentioned in the books of Seerah as well about Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that when he was born, his mother Amina, Hazrat Amina radiyallahu ta'ala anha, so it's mentioned that when she gave birth to Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, there was not a speck of blood on Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So what we can understand is that it is possible, but again rare, for women to give birth to a child without blood coming out. But generally speaking, there will be some bleeding. So that's why there is no kind of minimum limit of bleeding. It could be a few hours, it could be a few days, it could be 10 days, it could be 20 days. But the maximum limit of bleeding is 40 days. So in other words, if a woman bleeds for more than 40 days, then we call that to be istihada, which in other words means, because it's istihada, so in other words means that after day 40, if the husband wants to have relations with her, then that would be allowed. But below below the 40-day limit, then obviously if she's still bleeding, the wife, then the husband would not be allowed to have relations with his wife. So as I said, I don't want to go into too detail about haze, about periods and postnatal bleeding and about istihaza here, because obviously that has got to do more with purification, more from a feminine point of view. Obviously what I just wanted to just explain just very briefly is so that you know what types of bleeding, i.e. periods and postnatal bleeding. So those types of bleeding you're not allowed to have relations with, but anything beyond that, something called istihada, then it's permissible for a husband to have relations with his wife. Now there's one point which I'm going to mention before we finish and conclude this section and move on to the next section, and that is regarding that if a wife, say for example, is on her periods for 10 days, if a wife, say for example, is on her menses, say for the maximum 40 days, so what can a husband do during those 10 days? What can a husband do during those 40 days? Because especially for men, to be away from relations with his wife for 40 days could be sometimes a bit difficult for him. So what can the husband do when his wife is on her periods, or when his wife is on her postnatal bleeding? What kind of way can the husband derive pleasure and derive benefit from his wife? So this is the next point to mention here. Now there's two ways to look at it, and I request all the attendees to make some notes, inshallah. Now the first part is, remember, this is regarding when one's wife is on her periods or postnatal bleeding. Now the first part is that the area which is above her navel and below her knees. So the first scenario is the area which is above his wife's navel, or which is below his wife's knees, that particular area. It is permissible for the husband to derive skin to skin, i.e. direct pleasure with his wife. So I'll just repeat that again. So remember, his wife's on her periods, so the area which is below the navel and the knees, that's kind of covered, but the area which is above the navel and also below the knees, it is permissible for the husband to have kind of direct, it is permissible for the husband to have a kind of direct skin to skin contact, with his wife. And what I mean by skin to skin contact, in other words, he's allowed to touch that area, he's allowed to, say for example, kiss that area, he's allowed to, say for example, rub his private parts over that area. All these things would be permissible, which is the area above the navel and below the knees. So remember, everyone, those who are attending, this is regarding when a person or a woman or a sister is on her haze or on her periods. Okay, so that's the first point. Now the second scenario, inshallah, I'll give everyone time to ask questions. So if everybody could just listen to the points firstly, then inshallah I'll give an opportunity to ask questions later. Now the second situation is the area which is below the navel up to the knees, i.e. the private part region. Now regarding the private part region, the scholars have mentioned that skin to skin contact is not permissible. During that like skin to skin contact, that's not allowed. So during that period, the area between the navel and the knees, skin to skin contact is not allowed, is not permissible. And what I mean by skin to skin contact, in other words, his wife's on the period, so for him to kind of touch that area, i.e. to touch her thighs, to even touch her private parts and so on, with his hands, with his private parts, to kiss that area, these kind of things, that is totally unlawful, that is totally haram. Obviously, actual relations is definitely haram, but even like touching that area with his hands, even like, touching her thighs, her upper thighs, and so on and so forth, then that is all unlawful and that is all haram. However, what is permissible is that it is permissible for him to have indirect contact with his wife in that particular area. So what I mean by indirect contact, everyone, is that, as mentioned in the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, that if there is a kind of izar, in other words, if the wife is wearing something which is like a towel or a cloth or something which is covering the area from her navel up to her knees, so if that area is covered and thereafterwards the husband was to touch that area, the husband, say for example, was to kiss that area, the husband was to like say rub his private parts over that area, then that would be allowed as long as that area is covered. Obviously, if it's uncovered and it's skin to skin, then it's haram. But if it's indirect, i.e. non-skin to skin related, and if he was to like basically the wife had that area covered and then he touches her, he kind of like derives benefit there, then that would be permissible and that would be allowed. Okay, so I'll just reiterate or repeat that particular point again. So the area which is above the navel and below the knees, then obviously skin to skin contact is permissible. Touching that area, fondling that area, kissing that area, rubbing his private parts over that area will be allowed, will be permissible. However, the area which is from the navel up to the knees, then as I was saying, the skin to skin contact is haram, touching that area is haram, kissing that area is haram, obviously actual penetration is haram. But if it's kind of covered, then it is permissible for him to derive pleasure with on that area by him touching it, by him, say for example, rubbing his private parts. All these things will be permissible and will be allowed. So inshallah, that concludes this section about haram times to have relations with one's wife. What I'll do is that I'll give everyone the opportunity to ask me some questions by using the message which is, or the email system, which is on the right hand corner of your screen. Now during the lesson, some brothers and sisters have emailed me some questions, so I'm just going to quickly go over it now. Sister asked that when blood does not come out, is there any need for ritual bath? So I'm assuming that what the sister was asking is that when a sister gives birth to a child and no blood comes out, so is there a requirement for a farz ghusl, a ritual bath? So the answer will be no. So there wouldn't be a requirement for a ritual bath. Another question here posed by sister. She's asking that I mentioned when I was explaining that one of the reasons why scholars, even doctors as well, say that you should not have relations with your wife during a period is because there's a possibility that she may fall pregnant, and if she falls pregnant, there is a greater risk and likelihood that the child may be born deformed. So the sister was asking that would that same kind of is that same danger there if one was to have relations with his wife during her istihada? Because I mentioned that during istihada you are allowed to have relations, but is that danger still there that if she was to fall pregnant, the child will be born deformed? So the answer is no, because it's quite clearly mentioned in the hadith that women who have istihaza problems, in other words, women who have a habit of surplus bleeding, so it's mentioned quite clearly in the hadith that that is got to do more with a medical reason. It's got nothing to do with period blood. So therefore, if a husband does have relations with his wife during that period, then inshallah ta'ala there would be no such issues with regards to the child being born deformed. Again, a sister is asking that when blood does come after birth, like if somebody was to give birth to a child and some blood comes out, then do they have to do ghusl? So the answer is yes, they will have to do ghusl. So if any blood comes out, then they would have to do ghusl. Okay, there's another question about, is there a particular time where there's a possibility of the wife falling pregnant? So are there any times when a husband and wife can have relations where there is a possibility of them falling pregnant? So the answer is that there isn't actually a particular time when husband and wife can have relations and that will then mean that the wife will fall pregnant. There isn't something or a particular time regarding that. Because obviously, remember, I think I may have touched on it last week as well, that a woman or a sister falling pregnant, that's all down to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. So there isn't a particular time when, if they were to have relations, they fall pregnant, if that makes sense. It's all down to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another question here is, how should a wife go about performing ghusl if she's in a state of sexual impurity and gets a period while she is in that state? So so I think the question the sister is asking is, she may have had relations with, or there may be a sister who may have had relations with her husband, and she's obviously in the state of major impurity, so she needs to have ghusl, and then probably at the same time she started her periods as well. So obviously what she could do if she wants is that she can have a bath, she can have a ghusl, just like for cleanliness, but that ghusl she's going to have, or that bath or that kind of ghusl she's going to have, it's not going to make her pure or clean. In other words, say that it's not going to allow her to, say for example, pray salah or to recite the Holy Quran, these kind of things. What I'm trying to say is that she should still have the bath or the ghusl. It's not compulsory on her, because when you look at it, there's actually there's no kind of necessity. In other words, because if she was to have the bath or the ghusl, then it's not going to allow her to pray salah. Why? Because she's also started her periods as well. So she doesn't have to actually have a bath, but what I would advise is that more out of cleanliness and so on, so that no kind of like impurity, no kind of like semen or these kind of things are left over in that particular part. So therefore, it is best that she kind of has a ghusl at that particular time. Okay, I'll take one more question and then inshallah I'll continue with the lesson, and then I'll take some further questions in the next section. A sister here is asking that, is there any particular time during the day when having a physical relationship is not allowed? So is there like any time during the day when you're not allowed to have relations? Now I think I mentioned before that there are some opinions of Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu, like statement. These are not hadiths by the way, but they're like statements of Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu, where it's mentioned Hazrat Ali anhu has said that one should not have relations with his wife after Maghrib Salah, because that's when shaitan comes in its abundance. Like there's a lot of shaitan at that time. So therefore it could be so that one could be affected, or the child could be affected by the devils. So there are some opinions of Hazrat Ali anhu like that, but they are just like classed as very weak opinions. So therefore there isn't actually a particular time when it is haram and unlawful to have relations. As I was explaining last week even as well, that you can have relation during the day. It's not necessary that you have to have it during the night. Okay, now what I'm doing at the moment is I'm just writing down on the whiteboard a name of a website. This is a website which I answer questions on. So what you could do, if I don't have time to take all the questions today, is you could also post some of these questions through the Q&A section on the website, and then inshallah I'll try my best to kind of answer them over the coming week. Okay, so whilst I do that, I'll continue also with the next part of the handout. So if we have a look at the next part of the handout, and that is regarding intimacy during pregnancy. So in other words, is it permissible for a husband to have relations with his wife during her pregnancy or during her hamal? Is that permissible or not? Now this is like a common question which husbands, even wives, ask as well, that when their wives are pregnant, are they allowed to have relations with them? So I mentioned there in the notes which I have provided that Islamically speaking, there is nothing wrong with that. In other words, there is nothing wrong with the husband having relations with his wife during her hamal or during her pregnancy. There's no problem, there's no impermissibility with regards to that. But I've also mentioned on the second paragraph that if, say for example, if a doctor has advised the sister or has advised that, look, because your wife is kind of heavily pregnant, it's best that you don't have relations with her, then in that situation it is best for the husband to refrain from having relations with his wife. And basically what he can do in that situation is do what I explained earlier on, when one's wife is on her periods or postnatal bleeding, and that is like derive basically benefit from her by touching her other parts of her body, or rubbing his private parts with the other parts of his wife's body, these kind of things. So he could do those kind of things. That is allowed, that is permissible. But obviously what would not be allowed, or in particular if the doctors have said, look, it's not safe for you to have relations with his wife, so what will not be allowed is for him to have full sexual relations with his wife when the wife is pregnant. In particular, everybody listen carefully, like in particular when the doctors have said, like, look, it's not ideal for you to do that. Obviously if his wife is at the very beginning of the pregnancy and he has relations with her, then that's fine. But obviously when she's a bit more to say 7-8 months into her pregnancy and she's expecting anytime soon, then for the husband to have relations with her at that time may be a bit harmful. So it's best that he kind of refrains, in particular if the doctors are advising him to do so. Also, another point to remember is that if he is having relations with her at the very beginning of the pregnancy, or just say 3-4 months into the pregnancy, then it's always ideal that the husband, he should be very gentle and extremely careful when he has relations with his wife. So in other words, he should not be forceful. He should bear in mind that his wife is pregnant, she's expecting. So therefore, if the husband is on top of his wife, then sometimes the pressure may affect the child, the force may affect the child. So these things the husband should keep in mind when the husband is having relations with his wife who happens to be pregnant, that to be gentle and to be considerate as much as possible. I'll just take this opportunity to clarify a hadith, actually a hadith and also a particular belief which some of the Arabs had at the very beginning of Islam. And this is mentioned in a hadith in Sahih Muslim and also in Sunan Abu Dawood as well, that the Arabs during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would believed in something called ghayla with a gain. And ghayla basically means that, well, that's their assumption or their thought was that if a husband has relations with his wife who happens to be pregnant, so they believe that the child who the wife is going to give birth to, that child will will grow up and he will be born weak. He'll be born da'ifan, i.e. he'll be born weak. And because he will be born weak, so therefore, as mentioned in the hadith, that when, say, for example, he's riding a horse or a camel, he will easily be knocked off the horse and the camel. So because of that reason, the Arabs there, they would abstain from having relations with their wives during their pregnancy. So then the hadith goes on to explain that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, well, you know, the Romans in particular, they also do this as well, but we see nothing in them. So therefore Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed that. So what we can understand is that ghayla, or having relations with one's wife during her pregnancy, is permissible. But if the doctors have said that, look, it's best that you don't because you may harm her, then in that situation, it's best that you refrain from it. Any questions about this particular section? If anybody wants to email or put a question through, I'll just take this opportunity to answer some other ones which some of the sisters have mentioned. Sister has emailed here that you mentioned that the minimum days of 3 days is the minimum days for menstruation cycle. So does it mean in case I finish my period in 2 days, I have to wait for another day? I don't want to go too into detail about rules about periods here, but just very briefly to that sister is that yes, just say for example you bled for 2 days, then you should wait for another day, i.e. 3 days, and then basically determine whether you are on your periods or not. So if you do bleed on day 3, so that means you are on your period, so that's fine. Obviously you will be abstaining from salah. But if, say, on the 3rd day you realize that there's no bleeding, then the 2 days you bled prior to, that will be treated as istihada. So therefore, as I just explained, that during istihada, it's not unlawful to, say, for example, pray salah. During istihada, it's not unlawful to have relations with one's wife. So therefore, the 2 days prayers, one will have to repeat that and one will have to do qaza of that. Okay, another question here that okay, okay, I think there's some questions here. Okay. Okay. Obviously somebody's asking about my email and so on. I said that if you have a look at the whiteboard, which is like right next to the screen here, you'll find that that's the website I run, www.daruliftabirmingham.co.uk. So if you have any questions, then you can post it through the website there. Okay, I'll make a start in the next section, inshallah. Okay, now the next section in the handouts is regarding preparation for relations. In other words, what kind of preparations the husband and the wife should go through when it comes to having relations. Now, somebody may think this to be trivial or something which is not important, but actually this is a very, very important part of the relations and the intimacy, and that is preparation. It's not like you just decide that, okay, we are going to have relations tonight and that's it. But actually, for the husband and the wife to benefit from their union, or to be more precise, for the husband and the wife to enjoy their relationship and their union, and not only that, for to protect the husband from looking at unlawful women, to protect the wife from desiring other men, it is important that the husband and wives, they kind of beautify themselves for each other. The sad thing, or the unfortunate thing we have nowadays, is that at home, what I mean by that is, at home, when the husband and wife are living together, then the husband, he'll wear proper scruffy clothing. The wife, in the same time, will also wear proper scruffy and messy clothing. But when they go out, say for example, to a wedding together, or when they are going for other functions or other kind of parties, then we see the husband and the wife, they dress up so beautifully and they dress up so much. But when they dress up, they're not actually dressing up for their husband. They're dressing up, oh, I want to look beautiful in that particular party. I want to look beautiful in that particular function. So when you look at it, their intentions are, in a way, slightly tainted as to why are they dressing up in that particular way for. Because a woman or a sister, when she dresses up, she should dress up in the nice, beautiful way, but it should be done with the intention of the husband, not to say with the intention to impress other men at a party or at a function. And the same also goes for men as well, that at home, why is it that they don't hardly dress up properly, but when it comes to a wedding, when it comes to other functions, when it comes to other kinds of engagements and parties, they wear the best suit, they wear the best clothes, they apply the best aftershave and the best deodorants. Why do they do that? Because they are doing it to impress others. So what I'm trying to say is that dressing up for each other is something which is very, very beneficial, and something, when it comes for the relations as well, it's something which is very, very good, because it kind of helps the husband and the wife to kind of enjoy that union of intimacy and relation together. Now, I'll just mention a couple of points that, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created human beings such that they like something which is bright. When they see someone dressed up, or when they see something nice and bright, human beings, they like that. Naturally, they like that. Naturally, that's why if you're walking on the street and you see someone in bright colored clothing, naturally your sight will go to that particular person. So similarly, naturally human beings, they like bright colored clothing. And that's why it's mentioned in the Holy Quran about the Hura'in. Hura'in, i.e. about the heavenly wives. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? He says, كَأَنَّهُنَّ الْيَاقُوتُ وَالْمَرْجَانِ, which means that the heavenly wives will be in yaqut, will be in rubies, wal marjan, and in corals or in emeralds. In other words, the hureen, the heavenly wives in Jannah, they'll be so beautifully dressed in nice rubies, in nice emeralds. They'll be wearing nice bracelets and jewelries that it will make the people of Jannah look at them. It will seduce the people of Jannah. So what I'm trying to say is that the more beautiful you look, the more your husband will look at you. The more beautiful the men are dressed, the more the wife would want to be with you, and the more the wife would want to have the relation with you. So first and foremost, very, very important, preparation is very, very important. So I've just mentioned a couple of things there. If we have a look at the handout which is in front of us, that there are two things with regards, well, if you have a look at the first two things of preparation. Number one is cleanliness. So in other words, it's important that wives, they try to clean themselves, just like make themselves look nice and presentable when they are having relations with their husbands. And the same also, by the way, goes for husbands as well. Because sometimes what happens is that when it comes to relations, the husbands, they just expect their wives to be nicely adorned, but they themselves don't make any effort. But actually what this particular point is telling us, that both the wife and the husband should be nicely kind of clean, should be nicely adorn themselves, should make themselves presentable for the act of union and for the act of relations. There's actually a hadith which I'll just mention. This hadith can be found in Kanzul Ummal, and this hadith is mainly for the men. So the brothers who have attended the course, it's just mainly for you brothers, but obviously the sisters could also listen in and they could also learn something important from it as well. Now this hadith, which can be found in Kanzul Ummal, narrated by Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu anhu, when it says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, "Ighsilu thiyabakum." Ighsilu thiyabakum, which means wash your clothes. This is Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying to the men that ighsilu thiyabakum, wash your clothes. Wa khudhu min shu'urikum, and it goes on to say that cut your hair. In other words, excess hair. So obviously excess hair could refer to your mustache, that men should trim their mustache, or make it short, don't make it too big and unhygienic, that it covers the lips, so when they're eating the food kind of, or the salan or whatever you eat, touches the hair on the mustache, so they should trim their mustache. Also wastaku, men should do miswak, men should brush their teeth. Watazayyanu watanzufu, and men should kind of beautify themselves, try to make themselves look neat, tidy, presentable. And then the next part of the hadith goes on to say, فَإِنَّ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ لَمْ يَكُونُوا يَفْعَلُونَ كَذَلِكَ, that the Banu Israel, they did not do anything like that. I.e., the men of the Banu Israel, they would not do that. In other words, they would not look after themselves. They would not kind of say, for example, how shall I say, they would not like look after themselves. They would not clean themselves. They would not purify themselves. So what then happened? فَزَنَتْ نِسَاؤُهُمْ, which means that their women, nisa'uhum, i.e. the women of the Banu Israel, their women then started committing zina, zanat, i.e. they started having extramarital relations with other men. Why? Because their husbands did not look after themselves. So what I'm trying to say from this particular point here about cleanliness and adornment is that the husband and the wife as well, both, when it comes to, generally speaking, when it comes to relations with one's wife, try to clean yourself, adorn yourself, make yourself look nice and presentable. And in particular, when it comes to relations, make sure that you look yourself the part, so that the husband and wife are able to enjoy the union and the relation together. Because as I already explained before, that if the husband's not dressed properly, or the wife's not dressed properly, or just say the husband's breath smells or the wife's breath smells, then when they're having relations, then that relation is going to be a proper turn off for the husband and also for the wife as well. You know, the husband will be having relations with his wife, but he's just thinking, oh, just like, you know, let's just do this quickly because, you know, my wife, she smells, you know, her body smells, her mouth smells, this smells, that smells. And similarly vice versa, when the wife is having relations with the husband, but if the husband's mouth is smelling, if the husband's hair is smelling, if the husband's body is smelling of sweat, and he is having relations with her, the wife will be thinking, oh, this is a total turn off. How can I have relations with this man? And instead of like having relations or enjoying that moment, the husband and wife, because the other spouse is not making an effort, then what will happen is that it may lead to the husband thinking about other women when he's having relations with his wife. It may lead to the wife thinking about other men when her husband is having relations with her. And this is something which I'll mention later on as well, about when you're having relations, you should always think about your wife, not about any other women. Why? Because that could also amount to a type of zina and a type of adultery, but I'll touch on that some other time later on in the course. If we have a look at the next part of the handout, point number 3, fragrance or scent. So in other words, another way of beautifying oneself is husband, like putting on some deodorant, putting on some creams. The same also with regards to the wife as well, that the wife, she should also like put you know, some fragrance and some kind of scent and these kind of things on. So the wife should do these kind of things. Why? Because as you know, smell, the same way looks and bright clothing attracts people, similarly smell, alhamdulillah, also attracts people as well. So if the smell is nice, then the husband will kind of enjoy the moment when he's having relations with his wife. If the husband smells nice, the wife will also enjoy the moment when she is having relations with the husband. So scent, fragrance, these kind of things are very, very important, you could say, when it comes to the relation part. Obviously, one point to remember is that when it comes to the scent or the fragrance, just make sure that they are halal ingredients. But even if the ingredients is such that it is made out of alcohol, dennet, or other types of chemical alcohol, then it is still permissible for men to apply them and also for women to apply them as well. Just very briefly, a common question which brothers and sisters ask is regarding, you know, these perfume bottles sometimes, or these deodorants, they have alcohol written in the back. So the question they ask is that, is it permissible for men to apply these types of deodorants? Is it permissible for women to apply these types of fragrances and perfumes? So the answer is that obviously we will encourage brothers and sisters to apply perfume or fragrance or deodorants or scents which is non-alcoholic and it is totally 100% halal. However, if that is not the case, if that is, say for argument's sake, not the case, then in other words, what I mean by that is they just have, or they can only get alcohol, dennet related perfume or scents, then in that situation it is permissible for the husband, it is permissible for the wife to apply those types of perfume and fragrances. Why is it permissible? So the simple reason is because they are not actually considered to be what do you call it, actual alcohol, if that makes sense. They're all chemical form of alcohol. What I mean by actual alcohol, in other words, they're not considered to be like your wine or your khamar, you know, the wine or the beer which is sold in the shops or in the pubs and so on. They're not considered to be one of those, but they're considered to be more kind of scientific and chemical alcohol. So because of that reason, it is permissible to kind of, say for example, apply those types of perfume or fragrances without it being impermissible or without it being unlawful. And the next point, which I kind of mentioned already briefly at the top, is another way of kind of preparing oneself for the relations with his wife is regarding makeup and jewelry. So that's mainly for women, that if women, say for example, were to beautify themselves, were to apply, say for example, jewelries, necklaces, bracelets, these kind of things, if they were to wear nice seductive clothing, if that makes sense, seductive clothing, these kind of things, if they were to wear appealing clothing, even because remember, nice appealing clothing, if it's done in front of your husband, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not considered to be against how should I say, piety or taqwa or anything. Obviously what will be wrong or haram is if a woman was to wear seductive kind of clothing outside, in the public, then that is haram and lawful. But when it's in the bedroom, when it's at home in front of the husband, if the wife was to wear nice revealing clothing when they're having relations, then there's nothing wrong with that. And again, it's all down to intentions. If it's done with the intention to please the husband, because my husband likes those kind of clothing, and it's done with the intention to please him, then there is nothing wrong with that. So these are 4 points to remember when it comes to preparation: cleanliness, adornment, fragrance or scent, and number 4 is makeup and jewelries, or just wearing nice clothing. So these things are recommended. Does any brothers or sisters have any questions before we move on to before the actual lesson finishes? Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? A sister asked a question here, is that where can I get the handouts? So I think brother Azhar, I think his name is Azhar Yasin from Cordoba Academy, I think he's in charge of the handouts. So you could actually contact him. If you want me to give it to you, then if you could just send me an email via the Darul Ifta Birmingham website, and inshallah I'll email you the handouts to you as soon as possible. Sister is asking a question, that is it always necessary to remove all the clothes for having relations? Can they only remove the lower garments and have relations? So the answer is yes. It's not necessary that you have to be stark naked, but actually we look at that, actually it's considered to be against manners and against etiquette to be totally stark naked when you're having relations. You should at least cover yourself with a blanket or something like that. Well, inshallah, we'll touch on that next week. You should at least try to cover yourself with a blanket or something when you start your relations. But if you don't, if say for example you're covering yourself, but also on top of that you don't want to remove all your clothing, then that's fine. If you just remove the lower garments, then that is also sufficient as well. Any other questions anybody wants to ask? Or okay, obviously again, apologies for what happened at the beginning of the lesson. I think there was a delay in terms of getting the equipments and everything ready, but inshallah that would not be the case next week. Okay, a couple of more questions. Somebody's asking, when a woman wants to beautify herself, she follows someone's example. What is the ruling on looking at other women to learn? So the answer is that there's nothing wrong with looking at other women and the way they beautify themselves. Then you do that with the intention to please your husband. There's nothing wrong with that, but you just have to make sure that what the other sister is doing, like the way she's beautifying herself, that thing should not be against the rules of the Sharia. So what I mean by that is that the way she's kind of dressing up, again, you probably be thinking, no, what do you mean by that? We'll look at that later. I'll give you some examples of sometimes people, they kind of do some cross-dressing. I'll mention next week, inshallah. Cross-dressing means that people, they they dress up in a particular way. So I'll give you an example. What I mean by dress up in a particular way, in other words, just say the husband's got a fetish where he wants his wife to dress up like a nurse. I'll just give you an example. Sometimes some brothers, they ask these kind of questions that they want their wife, they went to the doctors and they saw a nurse there, the husbands, so they got this attraction for nurses, so they want their wives to kind of dress up like a nurse when they are having relations. So something like that is not allowed, because the reason why is because when the husband is having relations with you, he's not actually thinking about you, he's actually thinking about a particular nurse. So that's not allowed. But obviously when it comes to, like, say, just wearing revealing clothing like lingeries or these kind of things, then there's nothing wrong with that. That is kind of considered to be permissible, as long as it is done in front of the husband when you are having relation with the husband, then that is okay. Another question sister is asking is, do you know the clothes which have been removed because you haven't had intercourse using those clothes, then they will remain pure? So the answer is yes, they will remain pure. But even say, for example, if you were, say, wearing a t-shirt, or just say a husband was wearing a t-shirt, or a wife was wearing some kind of top, and they had relations, as long as no semen or nothing impure went onto the t-shirt or onto the garment, then that's fine. That particular garment or that particular t-shirt does not become impure, does not become najas. So it's not about you have to remove it for the clothes to be pure, even if you got it on you. But if no semen or nothing like that's gone onto the clothes, then that's fine. The clothes does not become impure and najas because of that. I think a sister is just typing, so I'll just wait for her question. Then afterwards we will conclude the lesson, inshallah. Next week we will start on the next part of the handouts regarding foreplay, and then onto positions and so on. So inshallah, that's what we will intend to do in next week's lesson. Okay, the final question the sister is asking, that somebody told her that money is pure and mazi is impure. Is that right? It depends who you follow. What I mean by that is, according to Imam Shafi rahimullah, he's of the opinion that money is pure and mazi is impure. So therefore, if somebody is having relations with his wife and money was to come out and then touch the garment and so on, then that's not going to make the clothes impure, according to Imam Shafi. However, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he's of the opinion that money is impure the same way mazi is impure. And I explained the difference last week to everyone, that money is the semen, the thicker semen which comes out at the time of intercourse, whereas mazi is more like the thinner part. So both, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, is considered to be impure. Other Imams slightly differ on this particular topic. Inshallah, we'll leave the lesson here. Inshallah, if any brothers or sisters have any questions they would like to ask, then the website information is on the whiteboard on next to this the chat screen. So therefore, if you have any questions, then you could post me an email there, and inshallah I'll try to answer that as soon as possible. May Allah give us the ability to act as what has been said. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.